Chapter 3 of Inspector French's Greatest Case by Freeman Wills Crofts. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganan. Inspector French's Greatest Case, Chapter 3, Gathering the Threads. The fact that he had been out all the previous night was not, in Inspector French's eyes, any reason why he should be late at his work next day. At his usual time, therefore, he reached New Scotland Yard and promptly engaged himself in the compilation of a preliminary report on the Hatton Garden crime. This completed, he resumed direct work on the case. There were still several obvious inquiries to be made, inquiries which might almost be called routine, in that they followed necessarily from the nature of the crime. The first of these was an interview with the other members of the Duke and Peabody staff. An Oxford Street bus brought him to the end of Hatton Garden, and soon he was once more mounting the staircase to the scene of his last night's investigation. He found Mr. Duke standing in the outer office with Archer and the typist and office boy. "I was just telling these young people they might go home," the principal explained. "I'm closing the office until after the funeral." "That will be appreciated by poor Mr. Gething's family, sir. I think it's very kind of you and very proper too. But before this young lady and gentleman go, I should like to ask them a question or two." "Of course. Will you take them into my office? Go in, Miss Prescott, and tell Inspector French anything he wants to know." "I'm afraid you won't be able to do quite so much as that, Miss Prescott." French smiled, continuing to chat pleasantly in the hope of allaying the nervousness the girl evidently felt. But he learned nothing from her except that Mr. Duke was a very nice gentleman of whom she was somewhat in awe, and that Mr. Gething had always been very kind to her and could be depended on to let her do whatever she wanted. Neither both the clerk Archer nor the pupil Harrington was she communicative, and the office boy Billy Newton she dismissed as one might a noxious insect, a negligible, if necessary, evil. Mr. Gething had been, as far as she could form a conclusion, in his usual health and spirits on the previous day, but she thought he had seemed worried and anxious for the past 2 or 3 weeks. As to herself, she liked the office and got on well with her work, and was very sorry about poor Mr. Gething. On the previous day she had gone straight from the office and had remained at home with her mother during the entire evening. French, satisfied she had told him all that she knew, took her fingerprints and let her go. From Billy Newton, the precocious office boy, he learned but one new fact. Newton, it seemed, had been the last to leave the office on the previous evening, and before Mr. Gething had gone, he had instructed him to make up the fire in the chief's office, as he, Gething, was coming back later on to do some special work. The boy had built up a good fire and had then left. When French returned to the outer office, he found a new arrival. A tall, good-looking young man was talking to Mr. Duke, and the latter introduced him as Mr. Stanley Harrington, the clerk pupil who was qualifying for a partnership. Harrington was apologizing for being late, saying that on his way to the office he had met an old schoolfellow of whom he had completely lost sight, and who had asked him to accompany him to King's Cross, whence he was taking the 9:50 a.m. train for the north. The young man seemed somewhat ill at ease, and as French brought him into the inner office and began to talk to him, his nervousness became unmistakable. French was intrigued by it. From his appearance, he imagined the man would have, under ordinary circumstances, a frank, open face and a pleasant, outspoken manner. But now his look was strained and his bearing furtive. French, with his vast experience of statement makers, could not but suspect something more than the perturbation natural under the circumstances, and as his examination progressed, he began to believe he was dealing with a normally straightforward man who was now attempting to evade the truth. But none of his suspicions showed in his manner, and he was courtesy itself as he asked his questions. It seemed that Harrington was the nephew of that Mr. Vanderkamp who acted as traveller for the firm. Miss Vanderkamp, the Dutchman's sister, had married Stuart Harrington, a prosperous Yorkshire stockbroker. Stanley had been well educated, and had been a year at college when a terrible blow fell on him. His father and mother, travelling on the continent, had both been killed in a railway accident near Milan. It was then found that his father, though making plenty of money, had been living up to his income, and had made no provisions for those who were to come after him. Debts absorbed nearly all the available money, and Stanley was left practically penniless. It was then that his uncle, Jan Vanderkamp, proved his affection. Out of his none too large means, he paid for the boy's remaining years at Cambridge, then using his influence with Mr. Duke to give him a start in the office. But shortly after he had entered on his new duties, an unexpected complication, at least for Mr. Duke, had arisen. The principal's daughter, Sylvia, visiting her father in the office, had made the acquaintance of the well-mannered youth, and before Mr. Duke realized what was happening, the two young people had fallen violently in love, with the result that Miss Duke presently announced to her horrified father that they were engaged. In vain the poor man protested. Miss Duke was a young lady who usually had her own way, and at last her father was compelled to make a virtue of necessity. He met the situation by giving the affair his blessing and promising to take Harrington into partnership if and when he proved himself competent. In this Harrington had succeeded, and the wedding was fixed for the following month, the partnership commencing on the same date. French questioned the young fellow as to his movements on the previous evening. It appeared that shortly after reaching his rooms on the conclusion of his day's work in the office, he had received a telephone message from Miss Duke saying that her father had just called up to say he was detained in town for dinner, and being alone, she wished he would go out to Hampstead and dine with her. Such an invitation from such a source was in the nature of a command to be ecstatically obeyed, and he had reached the Duke's house before 7 o'clock. But he had been somewhat disappointed as to his evening. Miss Duke was going out after dinner. She intended visiting a girls' club in Whitechapel run by a friend of hers, a Miss Amy Lestrange. Harrington had accompanied her to the East End, but she would not allow him to go in with her to the club. He had, however, returned later and taken her home, after which he had gone straight to his rooms. Skilful interrogation by French had obtained the above information, and now he sat turning it over in his mind. The story hung together, and if true, there could be no doubt of Harrington's innocence. But French was puzzled by the young man's manner. He could have sworn that there was something. Either the tale was not true, or it was not all true, or there was more which had not been told. He determined that unless he got a strong lead elsewhere, Mr. Harrington's movements on the previous night must be looked into and his statements put to the test. But there was no need to let the man know he was suspected, and dismissing him with a few pleasant words, French joined Mr. Duke in the outer office. "Now, sir, if you are ready, we shall go round to your bank about the key." They soon obtained the required information. The manager, who had read the robbery in his morning paper, was interested in the matter and went into it personally. Not only was the key there in its accustomed place, but it had never been touched since Mr. Duke left it in. £1,000 in notes was also stolen, French went on. "Is there any chance that you have the numbers?" "Your teller might remember the transaction," Mr. Duke broke in eagerly. "I personally cashed a cheque for £1,000 on the Tuesday, the day before the murder. I got 16 50s and the balance in tens. I was hoping to carry off a little deal in diamonds with a Portuguese merchant whom I expected to call on me. I put the money in my safe as I received it from you, and the merchant not turning up, I did not look at it again." "We can but inquire," the manager said doubtfully. "It's probable we have a note of the 50s, but unlikely in the case of the tens. But it chanced that the teller had taken the precaution to record the number of all the notes. These were given to French, who asked the manager to advise the yard if any were discovered." "That's satisfactory about the notes," French commented when Mr. Duke and he had reached the street. "But you see what the key being there means? It means that the copy was made from the key which you carry. Someone must therefore have had it in his possession long enough to take a mould of it in wax. This, of course, is a very rapid operation. A couple of seconds would do the whole thing. A skilful man would hold the wax in the palm of his hand, palmed as the conjurers call it, and the key could be pressed into it in so natural a way that no unsuspecting person would be any the wiser. Now, I want you to think again very carefully. If no one but Mr. Gething handled the key, he must have taken the impression. There is no other way out. I would like you then to be sure that no one else ever did get his hands upon it, even for a moment. You see my point?" "Of course I see it," Mr. Duke returned a trifle testily. "But unanswerable as it seems, I don't believe Gething ever did anything of the kind. It would seem the likely thing to you, Inspector, because you didn't know the man. But I've known him too long to doubt him. Someone else must have got hold of the key, but I confess I can't imagine who. Someone at night while you were asleep? Mr. Duke shrugged his shoulders. I can only say it's unlikely. Well, consider the possibilities at all events. I must go back to headquarters. And I to the Gettings, Mr. Duke returned. I hear the wife is very ill. The shock has completely broken her down. You will let me know how things go on? Certainly, sir. Immediately have anything to report, you shall hear it. The police station was not far away, and soon French was bending over all the post-mortem of Charles Getting. He was not concerned with the actual remains, except to take prints from the dead fingers to compare with those found in the office. But he went through the contents of the pockets, among which he had hoped to gain some clues as to the nature of the business which had brought the dead man to the office. Unfortunately, there was nothing to give the slightest indication. The inquest had been fixed for 5 o'clock that evening, and French spent some time with the superintendent going over the evidence which was to be put forward by the police. Of the verdict there could of course be no doubt. Believing that by this time Mr. Duke would have left the Gettings, French thought that he might himself call there. The more he could learn about the old man, the better. He hailed a taxi, and some 15 minutes later reached Monkton Street, a narrow and rather depressing side street off the Fulham Road. The door of number 37 was opened by a brown-haired woman of some 35, with a pleasant and kindly, though somewhat worn expression. French took off his hat. Miss Getting? He inquired. No, I am Mrs. Gamagay. But my sister is in, if you wish to see her. She spoke with a sort of plaintive softness which French found rather attractive. I'm afraid I must trouble you both, he answered with his kindly smile, as he introduced himself and stated his business. Mrs. Gamagay stepped back into the narrow passage. Come in, she invited. We are naturally anxious to help you. Besides, the police have been very kind. Nothing could have been kinder than that constable who came round last night with the news. Indeed, everyone has been more than good. Mr. Duke has just been round himself to inquire. A time like this shows what people are. I was sorry to hear that Mrs. Getting is so unwell, French observed, and he followed his guide into the tiny front parlour. He was surprised to find the house far from comfortably furnished. Everything, indeed, bore the stamp of an almost desperate attempt to preserve decency and self-respect in the face of a grinding poverty. The threadbare carpet was worn into holes and had been neatly darned, and so had the upholstery of the two rather upright easy chairs. The leg of the third chair was broken and had been mended with nails and wire. Everything was shabby, though spotlessly clean, and evidently looked after with utmost care. Though the day was bitter, no spark of fire burned in the grate. Here, the inspector thought, was certainly a matter to be inquired into. If Getting was really as poor a man as this furniture seemed to indicate, it undoubtedly would have a bearing on the problem. My mother has been an invalid for many years, Mrs. Gamagay answered, unconsciously supplying the explanation French wanted. She suffers from a diseased hip bone and will never be well. My poor father spent a small fortune on doctors and treatment for her, but I don't think any of them did her much good. Now this news has broken her down altogether. She is practically unconscious, and we fear the end at any time. Allow me to express my sympathy, French murmured, and his voice seemed to convey quite genuine sorrow. What you tell me makes me doubly regret having to force my unpleasant business on your notice. But I cannot help myself. Of course I understand. Mrs. Gamagay smiled gently. Ask what you want, and I shall try to answer, and when you are finished with me, I'll relieve Esther with mother and send her down. But there was not a great deal that Mrs. Gamagay could tell. Since her marriage some 4 years previously, she had seen comparatively little of her father. That she idolized him was obvious, but the cares of her own establishment prevented her paying more than an occasional visit to her old home. French therefore soon thanked her for her help and asked her to send her sister down to him. Esther Getting was evidently the younger of the two. She was like Mrs. Gamagay, but better looking. Indeed, she was pretty in a mild, unobtrusive way. She had the same brown eyes, but so steadfast and truthful that even French felt satisfied that she was one to be trusted. Her expression was equally kind, but she gave the impression of greater competence than her sister. He could imagine how her parents leaned on her. A good woman, he thought, using an adjective he did not often apply to the sex, and the phrase in its fullest significance seemed only just adequate. Under the inspector's skillful lead, she described the somewhat humdrum existence which she and her parents had led for some years past. Her mother's illness seemed to have been the ruling factor in their lives, everything being subordinated to the sufferer's welfare, and the expenses in connection with it forming a heavy drain on the family exchequer. From Mr. Duke's records, French had learned that the dead man's salary had been about £400 per annum, though quite recently it had been increased to £450 following a visit the merchant had paid to the house during a short illness of his head clerk. Mr. Duke, Miss Gething said, had always acted as a considerate employer. Asked if her father had continued in his usual health and spirits up to the end, she said no, that for some 3 weeks past he had seemed depressed and worried. On different occasions she tried to find out the cause, but he had not enlightened her except to say that he had been having some trouble at the office. Once, however, he dropped a phrase which set her thinking, though she was unable to discover his meaning, and he had refused to explain. He had asked her did she believe that a man could ever be right in doing evil that good might come, and when she had answered that she could not tell, he had sighed and said, "Pray God you may never be called on to decide." On the evening of his death, it had been arranged that he would sit with Mrs. Gething in order to allow his daughter to attend a social connected with the choir of the church to which she belonged. But that evening he came home more worried and upset than she had ever seen him, and he had told her with many expressions of regret that some unexpected work which had just come in would require his presence that evening in the office, and that unless she was able to get someone else to look after her mother, she would have to give up her social. He had been too nervous and ill at ease to make a good meal, and had gone off about 8 o'clock, saying he did not know at what hour he would be back. That was the last time she had seen him alive, and she had heard nothing of him until the policeman had come with his terrible news about 11:30. Miss Gething was clearly at one with her sister in her admiration and affection for her father, and French recognized that she was as mystified as to his death as he was himself. Seeing that he could learn no more, he presently took his leave with renewed expressions of sympathy for her trouble. When he reached the yard, he found that enlarged photographs of the various fingerprints he had discovered were ready, and he sat down with some eagerness to compare the impressions with those on his cards. He spent some time counting and measuring lines and whorls, and at last reached the following conclusions. All the fingers on the safe, both inside and out, belonged either to Mr. Duke or to Mr. Gething, the majority being the latter's. The mark on the coal shovel was Mr. Gething's, and the remaining prints were those of various members of the office staff. His hopes of help from this source were therefore dashed. With a sigh, he looked at his watch. There would be time before the inquest to make some inquiries as to the truth of Archer's statement of his movements on the previous evening. Half an hour later, he had found the man with whom the clerk had dined in Ilford, and he fully substantiated the other's story. Archer was therefore definitely eliminated from the inquiry. The proceedings before the coroner were practically formal. Archer, Mr. Duke, and Constable Alcorn told their stories, and with very little further examination were dismissed. French and the local superintendent watched the case on behalf of the police, but did not interfere, and the next of kin of the deceased were not legally represented. After half an hour, the coroner summed up, and the jury, without retiring, brought in the obvious verdict of wilful murder against some person or persons unknown. That evening, when French had dined and had settled himself before the fire in the sitting room, with a pipe between his lips and his notebook on the table at his elbow, he set himself to take mental stock of his position and get a clear grasp of his new problem. In the first place, it was obvious that this Charles Gething had been murdered for the sake of the diamonds in Mr. Duke's safe. It was certain from the position of the wound that it could not have been accidental, nor could it by any chance have been self-inflicted. Moreover, a planned robbery was indicated by the cutting of the duplicate key. But the stones were not on old Gething's body. It therefore followed that someone else had taken them, though whether Gething had abstracted them from the safe in the first instance was not clear. So far, French had no trouble in marshalling his facts, but when he attempted to go further, he found himself in difficulties. There was first of all Gething's poverty. Though his salary was not unreasonable for his position, the drain of his wife's illness had kept him continually struggling to make ends meet. French let his imagination dwell on the wearing nature of such a struggle. To obtain relief, a man would risk a good deal. Then there was his knowledge of the wealth which lay within his reach, provided only that he made a spirited effort to obtain it. Had the man fallen before the temptation? That he had had something on his mind for 2 or 3 weeks before his death was obvious, and it was equally clear that this was something secret. When Mr. Duke inquired as to the cause of the trouble, Gething had mentioned family matters and his wife's health, but when his daughter had asked the same question, he had said it was due to business worries. The old man had therefore carried his efforts at concealment to direct lying to one or other. It seemed evident also that this worry or trouble had become intensified on the evening of his death. He had told his daughter that special business required his presence at the office. But Mr. Duke knew of no such business, nor was any record of it obtainable. But all these mysterious contradictions fell into line and became comprehensible if some 2 or 3 weeks back Gething had decided to rob the safe, and his special agitation on the evening of his death was accounted for if that were the date he had selected to make the attempt. On the other hand, several considerations did not support such a view. The first was the man's known character. He had worked for the firm for over 20 years, and after all that experience of him, Mr. Duke absolutely refused to believe in his guilt. His daughters also evidently had the warmest feeling towards him, and from what French had seen of the latter, he felt that would have been impossible had Gething been a man of bad or weak character. Such other evidence as French had been able to obtain tended in the same direction. Next, there was the open way in which Gething returned to the office. Had he intended to burgle the safe? Would he not have kept the fact of his visit a secret? Yet he told the office boy he was returning when instructing him to keep up the fire in the inner office, and he had also mentioned it to his daughter when discussing a proposed choir meeting. Further, there was this matter of the fire in the private office. If Gething was going to rob the safe, what was the fire for? It was not merely that he had instructed the office boy to keep it up. He had himself afterwards put coal on, as was evinced by his finger marks on the handle of the shovel. The robbing of the safe would have been a matter of minutes only. Did the episode of the fire not look as if Gething really was employed at some exceptional work, as he had stated to his daughter? On the whole, French thought the evidence for Gething's guilt was stronger than that against it, and he began to form a tentative theory somewhat as follows: that Gething, finding the conditions of his home life onerous beyond further endurance, and realizing the unusually valuable deposit in the safe, had decided to help himself, probably to a quite small portion, knowing that the loss would fall not on Mr. Duke but on the insurance company. That he had obtained an impression of the key from which he had had a duplicate made. That he had invented the business in the office as a safeguard should he be accidentally found there during the evening. That he had been found there, probably accidentally, by someone who, seeing the possibilities opening out in front of him, had been swept off his feet by the sudden temptation and had killed the old man and made off with the swag. This theory seemed to meet at least most of the facts. French was not pleased with it, but it was the best he could produce, and he decided to adopt it as a working hypothesis. At the same time, he kept an open mind, recognizing that the discovery of some fresh fact might put a different complexion on the whole affair. Next morning he put some obvious investigations in train. By astute indirect inquiries he satisfied himself that neither Mr. Gething nor any other worker in the Duke and Peabody office had the technical skill to have cut the key, and he put a man on to try and trace the professional who had done it. He issued a description of the stolen diamonds to the British and Dutch police, as well as to certain dealers from whom he hoped to obtain information of attempted sales. He saw that a general advice was sent to the banks as to the missing notes, and he searched unsuccessfully for any person who might have known of the treasure and who was unable satisfactorily to account for his movements on the night of the murder. But as the days slipped by without bringing any news, French grew seriously uneasy and redoubled his efforts. He suspected everyone he could think of, including the typist, the office boy, and even Mr. Duke himself, but still without result. The typist proved that she was at home all the evening. Billy Newton was undoubtedly at a Boy Scouts rally, while guarded inquiries at the principal's club and home proved that his statement as to how he had passed his evening was correct in every particular. Stanley Harrington's movements he had already investigated, and though the young man's alibi could not be absolutely established, he could find nothing to incriminate him. Baffled in every direction, French began to lose heart, while his superiors asked more and more insistent and unpleasant questions. The end of chapter 3.